Okay, let's unpack this. You sent over some really fascinating material, including that discussion with Wes Huff, all about a text that, well, it generates a ton of online buzz.
Yeah, and maybe a little confusion too, let's be honest.
Right. The Book of Enoch. So our mission today really is to try and cut through some of the myths and, get to the actual factual nuggets. What is this book? Where's it from?
And why are people still talking about it? Obsessing, even centuries later.
Exactly. It's got this aura, doesn't it? This intrigue.
It really does. And right off the bat, people wonder, is it some kind of banned book? You hear that a lot?
Yeah, like the church suppressed it or something.
Or does it hold these incredible secrets about, I don't know, mysterious supernatural beings? We're going to dig into all that based on the stuff you sent over.
Absolutely. And, diving into the sources, one of the first hurdles is just figuring out what to call it. How do we categorize literature like Enoch?
Yeah, that's a good starting point. The material introduces terms like apocryphal literature. Comes from a Greek word, apokryphos.
Which means?
Basically secret or strange.
Huh.
And in early Christianity, it was used for texts that were, outside the accepted canon, the official list of scripture.
Right. And it's really important, like the sources stress, this doesn't automatically mean it was heretical or wrong.
Exactly. Not necessarily bad, just separate in a different category.
Okay.
And then there's this other label you see, pseudepigraphical.
Sounds complicated.
It just means false writing in Greek. It's for documents that are attributed to some famous fellow from way back, but scholars generally don't think that person actually wrote it.
So the Book of Enoch is presented as if Enoch wrote it?
Precisely. Yeah. But the consensus is he wasn't the actual author. It's written in his name, so to speak.
Gotcha. Okay, so apocryphal, pseudepigraphical. Now, back to that band idea. Does the material support that at all?
No, not really. The sources are actually quite firm on this. They say Enoch was never considered banned. It was definitely part of important Jewish literature circulating at the time.
So where does the banned idea come from then?
Well, the confusion probably comes because it wasn't accepted into the official canon, either for Judaism or for most Christian traditions later on. But, not being in the canon isn't the same as being actively prohibited or suppressed.
That's a really key difference. Okay, so not banned, just outside the main list. Where does it fit in history then, time-wise?
It's old. It predates Jesus, quite significantly, actually. The material places it squarely in that period between the Old and New Testaments.
You mean the 400-year gap between Malachi and Matthew?
Yeah, that roughly 400-year period, sometimes called the 400 years of silence.
Right, I've heard that phrase.
But the sources clarify, and this is interesting, that silence is maybe not the best word.
Oh, so?
Well, it wasn't silent in the sense that nothing was being written. Far from it. Jewish literature was flourishing then.
Yeah,
you had texts like Enoch being composed.
Ah.
The silence refers more to the ancient understanding that, the direct voice of God through prophets, like you see in the Old Testament, was thought to have ceased during that time. Prophetic revelation had paused, maybe.
So lots of writing and thinking happening, just maybe not seen as direct prophecy in the same way.
Exactly. So when we talk about the Book of Enoch, what are we actually talking about? Is it one book?
Good question.
Usually we mean First Enoch. And the sources explain, First Enoch isn't really a single book by one author. It's more like a collection.
A collection of different Jewish texts?
Yeah, compiled over a pretty long period.
How long?
The material suggests it spans maybe 200 years before Jesus, and then sections were still being added perhaps 50 or even 100 years after Jesus.
Wow, so it evolved.
It did. And we find pieces of it in different ancient languages too. Aramaic, Coptic, Greek.
So complex history. What about the oldest bits? How far back do they go?
The oldest sections are really ancient. The sources date them to around 200 BC.
So 3rd century BC.
Yep. Firmly in the 3rd century BC. Mostly found in Aramaic and Greek. So, yeah, quite a while before Jesus.
And this is where it gets really interesting based on the materials. There's a connection to the New Testament itself.
There is. It's quite surprising for some people. The Book of Jude, right there in the New Testament.
Yeah.
It clearly knows about Enoch. It actually quotes directly from it.
Seriously. Jude quotes Enoch.
Yep. Jude verses 14 and 15. They line up with a passage in Enoch, usually cited as Enoch 1, verse 9, or maybe 1.14215, depending on the edition.
Whoa. Okay, so if a New Testament writer quotes it, does that mean they thought it was scripture? Like divinely inspired?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And the material helps clarify this. Just because Jude quotes Enoch doesn't automatically mean he considered it capital S scripture.
Okay. So why quote it then?
Well, The sources suggest Jude was likely using a piece of literature his audience would recognize, something familiar.
Right.
He uses it to make a point, to support his argument. It's a bit like how the Apostle Paul sometimes quotes Greek poets or philosophers.
Ah, okay. Like, quoting Plato doesn't mean Paul thought Plato was divinely inspired.
Exactly. He's drawing on the sort of shared cultural or literary knowledge of the day. He uses Enoch's words because they fit his argument, not necessarily because he's elevating Enoch to the level of, say, Isaiah.
That makes a lot of sense. So Enoch was part of their world, known, referenced, even if not on the official scripture list for most.
Precisely. And this literature, Enoch included, seems to be really wrestling with things the main biblical texts mention but don't always, fully explain.
Like what kind of things?
Well, a big one is the unseen realm.
Yeah.
All those supernatural beings.
Angels, demons, that sort of thing.
Yeah, angels, seraphim, cherubim, demons, these figures called watchers. The Bible mentions them, but it doesn't give, detailed backstories or explain their exact nature or hierarchy.
Right, they just kind of show up sometimes.
Exactly. And so literature from this 400-year period, like Enoch, tries to step into that gap. It explores these beings, tries to make sense of them.
Okay, so it's like supplemental material trying to fill in the blanks.
In a way, yeah, exploring the unseen world.
And that brings us to the titles, like angel. We use that term pretty broadly.
We do, and the sources give a really helpful insight here. The word angel isn't really about what the being is, its fundamental nature or ontology.
It's not.
No, it's about what it does, its function.
Okay.
The Hebrew word is malach. The Greek is angelos. Both just mean messenger.
So an angel is primarily a messenger. That's its job description.
Exactly. It's about the role, not the species, so to speak.
Right.
And the Bible talks about other spiritual beings God created who aren't primarily messengers. The material points to seraphim and cherubim.
Okay, seraphim and cherubim, what are they described as?
The sources call them supernatural divine throne guardians.
Throne guardians. Wow. That sounds intense and kind of mythological.
Well, yeah, and the sources connect it right back to the ancient world. This idea wasn't totally alien. Think about the Lamassu in Babylon.
The giant winged bulls with human heads.
Yeah, those massive figures guarding palace gates, or sphinxes in Egypt and later Greek culture. These powerful, often hybrid beings guarding sacred or royal spaces were a common motif.
Okay.
So in the biblical view, seraphim and cherubim kind of fill that role around God's throne or presence.
So when people share those biblically accurate angel memes online...
Yes. The wheels covered in eyes, multiple wings.
Yeah. Are those angels?
Well, the sources touch on this. Those depictions are usually based on descriptions of cherubim, like in the Book of Ezekiel.
Okay, so they are biblical beings.
Oh yeah, definitely biblical. But if we're being precise with the term angel meaning messenger...
Then calling a cherubim an angel is maybe technically off?
Technically, yeah, based on that functional definition. But the sources say it's understandable why people use angel broadly for all these, weird and wonderful heavenly beings. It's a common categorization.
Okay, that function versus being distinction is super helpful. Now, probably the bit about Enoch that gets the most discussion online, the Nephilim.
Oh yeah, the Nephilim. Enoch definitely dives into that. It's trying to explain those really strange events mentioned just before the flood story in Genesis.
Genesis chapter 6, right?
Exactly. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4.
Can you remind us what that says, according to the material?
Sure. It's basically, when men began to multiply, daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever. His day shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown."
Okay, so you've got sons of God, daughters of men, and their kids are the Nephilim, mighty men, men of renown. But yeah, as the sources point out, Genesis itself is pretty brief.
It's very brief and quite enigmatic. The material flat out says the meaning of Genesis 6 is not entirely clear.
Which opens the door for interpretation.
Big time. And because it's ambiguous, different ideas sprang up about who or what the Nephilim actually were.
What are the main ones the sources mention?
Well, one major view, and this is the one the Book of Enoch really runs with and expands on, is that the Nephilim are the offspring of fallen angels, the sons of God, mating with human women, the daughters of men.
Fallen angels and humans having children.
That's the idea in Enoch, yeah. But there's another interpretation too.
What's that?
That the sons of God and daughters of men aren't angels and humans, but just two different groups of humans. Maybe the godly line of Seth marrying into the ungodly line of Cain, who were mentioned earlier in Genesis.
Okay, so two human groups intermarrying. That sounds less dramatic.
Less dramatic, maybe less problematic biologically, but the sources do point out something about the word Nephilim itself.
Oh, a clue in the name.
Kind of. There's a linguistic hint. The root word in Hebrew seems to be nephal.
Nephal. And that means?
It literally means to fall.
To fall. So that connects the idea of fallen angels.
Exactly. It aligns pretty well with that ancient Jewish narrative, the one really prominent in Enoch, that these sons of God were divine beings who fell.
Okay, that's compelling, but it brings up a pretty big question, right? Which the sources mention.
Oh yeah, the huge puzzle. If the sons of God are spiritual beings, fallen angels, how could they physically, procreate with human women?
Yeah, how does that work?
That's the rub. It's a biological, theological knot that the text presents, and ancient writers, including whoever wrote Enoch, were definitely wrestling with it.
Are the Nephilim mentioned anywhere else in the Bible besides Genesis 6?
Yes, they pop up a few other times. The sources list Numbers 13.33. That's when the Israelite spies go into Canaan and get scared.
Right, they see giants.
Yeah, they see the Anakim, descendants of Anak.
Yeah.
And they say, we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. And they explicitly link them to the Nephilim.
Wow.
There's also a reference in Ezekiel 32.27, and they get mentioned in some deuterocanonical books too, Judith, Sirach, Baruch, Wisdom.
Okay, so Enoch, especially the oldest bit, the Book of the Watchers, it's basically part of this ancient Jewish conversation trying to figure out Genesis 6.
Exactly. Trying to make sense of this really brief, really mysterious passage in their foundational scriptures, explaining who these Nephilim were.
Right. Okay, so if Enoch wasn't really accepted as scripture by most Jews or early Christians, how did it end up being so well known today? Why are we even talking about it?
That's largely down to one specific tradition.
Yeah.
Its inclusion in the Ethiopian Bible.
Ah, right. The canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church?
Precisely. That's where it was preserved and held as scripture.
How did that happen? How did it get into their Bible?
Well, the sources trace it back to around the 4th century CE. You had Syrian missionaries traveling south to the kingdom of Axum.
Which is modern-day Ethiopia.
Right. And they brought with them a whole load of Christian literature, New Testament books in Greek, and also the Septuagint.
The Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Yeah, and the Septuagint often included more texts than what later became the standard Hebrew Old Testament, the Masoretic text.
Okay, so they brought a big library, basically, and the Ethiopian church's approach was?
The sources describe it as pretty non-discretionary. It seems like they largely just included all the Christian literature they received.
They didn't pick and choose as much.
Apparently not as much as was happening elsewhere. While the Latin West and the Greek East were having these intense debates about exactly which books counted as scripture and which didn't, the Ethiopian church seems to have sort of bypassed a lot of that.
They just accepted the whole package they were given.
That's the impression the material gives.
Yeah.
And the result is this unique canon that includes books like Enoch, books that, like we said, weren't accepted as scripture by most other ancient Jewish or Christian groups.
Fascinating. And this unique history leads directly to a myth that you see all over the internet. The sources call it out specifically.
Oh yeah. The idea that the Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible in the world.
Right. You see that claim constantly.
And the material you sent is very blunt about it. It says this is patently untrue.
Okay, let's break that down. Why is it untrue? What do the dates say?
Well, look at the actual manuscripts we have. The oldest complete copy of the Ethiopian Bible that survives today. It dates from the 14th century CE.
14th century, okay. How does that compare?
Compare that to the oldest existing manuscript of the entire Christian Bible. We have Old and New Testaments together. That's the Codex Sinaiticus.
And that's from
4th century CE. It's a Greek manuscript.
Wow, okay. 1,000 years earlier, basically.
Pretty much. And even if you look just at the Old Testament, the oldest surviving manuscript of the standard Hebrew text, the vocalized Masoretic text, dates to the 9th century CE.
So 9th century Hebrew, 4th century Greek, both significantly older than the 14th century for the oldest complete Ethiopian collection.
Exactly. The physical manuscript evidence just doesn't support the claim that the Ethiopian Bible as a collection is the oldest.
So why does that myth persist, do you think?
The sources don't really speculate much, but you can guess. Probably confusion, maybe people mixing up the age of parts of the Ethiopian canon, Like the Book of Enoch itself, which is very old.
Right, confusing the ages one book with the age of the whole collection.
Yeah, or maybe just misinformation spreading easily online. The key takeaway is, while Enoch is ancient and was uniquely preserved in the Ethiopian canon, that doesn't make the entire Ethiopian Bible collection the oldest surviving Bible.
That's a really important clarification. Wow, okay. This has been quite the journey. We went from trying to define Enoch, placing it historically,
Looking at its content, the Watchers, the Nephilim, its connection to Jude.
and then tracing how it ended up in the Ethiopian tradition and tackling that whole oldest Bible myth.
Yeah, it really shows how these ancient texts were living documents.
Yeah.
Interpreted differently, debated, included or excluded by different communities for different reasons.
Absolutely, and it leaves you thinking, doesn't it? When you consider how these ancient communities, how the writers of texts like Enoch grappled with explaining the really difficult, sometimes ambiguous parts of their core scriptures, these mysteries like Genesis 6, what does that tell you, the listener?
Yeah, think about that process. How canons were formed, how interpretation works across centuries. Or maybe just consider the incredible complex history packed into these ancient writings that we still get to explore today.